Donkey Kong Country Returns is 15 years old and is still better than 2024's quote-unquote Game of the Year. This is proof positive that Nintendo is so far ahead in the genre that it's not even really funny. It is downright embarrassing that Jeff Keighley and the Game Awards tried legitimizing something like Astro and then turning around and downplaying a downright classic, because it really needs to be understood that this game is a classic. I have heard so many people over the past couple of years try and say that this game isn't that big of a deal, it's not all that impressive, Nintendo keeps re-releasing it, and every time it comes up, people try to downplay it by negatively comparing it to the original Super Nintendo games, to comparing it to Tropical Freeze. Like, why? Like, what? This, upon my most recent playthrough, and please keep in mind I've played through this game several times over the past couple of years, playing this game again has made me realize just how amazing Donkey Kong Country Returns actually is. Playing it again, after playing the Wii version, after playing the 3DS version, after playing the new HD version, it does nothing but solidify the fact that Donkey Kong Country Returns is at the absolute peak of 2D platforming. This is a game filled with a number of interesting locations, great platforming, amazing visuals, great scenery, great set pieces, a lot of really fresh, interesting mechanics. This is the Donkey Kong Country game we wanted since the iconic original. In a lot of ways, this game is better than the Super Nintendo originals. But for the past several years, the industry has done everything in its power to try and downplay not only this game, but the 2D platforming genre as a whole, because this is a genre that is dominant on Nintendo platformers. I do think it's important to understand this going into this review, because if you actually look at the past re-releases of this game, when you look at the 3DS version, when you look at the Wii release, when you look at similar titles like Super Mario Bros. Wonder and situations like The Last of Us Part 2, you see a lot of really interesting discrepancies. For example, the big criticism regarding Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, right now, I already played that. You know, every single time this comes up, whether it's from RGT85 or IGN, there's always just some slack-jawed, ignorant, 40-year-old boomer trying to tell you that he played the game when it first came out and he doesn't want to play it again, and that's why he's giving it a low score. You know, it's not because of the game itself or the platform it's on or the genre or anything really solid. Like, oh no, the game is getting a 7 out of 10 because I already played that. Meanwhile, you look at games like The Last of Us Part 2, which is a re-release of a new game, of an old game that came out in 2020. The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered came out on PS5 last year it came out, and Game Journals gave it rave reviews across the board. You know, trying to legitimize it as a great game, trying to damage control its reputation, trying to paint Neil Druckmann and Naughty Dog as being the absolute masters of cinematic storytelling. Now, obviously that didn't work, but this is the double standard at play here. You know, you never really see the gaming media lash out at re-releases of non-Nintendo games. You know, whether it's like the Until Dawn remake or The Last of Us Part 2 or like the newest Skyrim release or like whatever, you know, Grand Theft Auto Remastered. Like, whenever you see other games get re-released, you know, it's always this thing of like, it's nice to play this old game again. I haven't played it in years. Again, But when it comes to Donkey Kong Country, when it comes to these Nintendo games, every single time you see people trying to bend over backwards, trying to say that these releases are lacking, that they don't add enough stuff, that the visual upgrades aren't there, that this is a disappointing, lackluster release. And that simply is not the case. For Donkey Kong Country Returns, this is the best looking version of the game with the new content and features introduced in the 3DS version, which for a lot of people was considered superior to the Wii version, but did not have the as nice of visual effects. So Donkey Kong Country Returns HD actually had a lot of reason to exist. It gave old players the definitive version of the game, you know, the additional content that was only on the 3DS version, and it kept the visual quality. So with that in mind, right, when you look at this game and what it offers, you understand that it actually does have a reason to exist. You know, the last re-release of this, Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D on the 3DS, that was in 2013. This idea that this is a game that has been like rehashed to death, that no one wants to see it, that like, you know, new players wouldn't want to play it, it's just completely delusional because this game is 15 years old. You know, like people always complain about like, where are the new Donkey Kong games? Like, why is Nintendo not putting out new Donkey Kong? Like, and then they turn around and slap games like this in the face for being re-releases aimed at a new audience, you know, because that's the reality of this release, of games like this, of games like Luigi's Mansion 2, of Another Code R, of like, you know, other remakes Nintendo has done. These games exist to be sold to a different audience. So if you're an old player who doesn't necessarily want to play through the game again, guess what? You don't have to. But when you're talking about the game on its actual merits, when you're talking about, you know, what the game actually is, what you end up with is an amazing experience that's going to appeal to younger Nintendo fans who did not have the chance to play the original. Again, the original, which is 15 years old. This really needs to be emphasized. This really needs to be talked about because the core critical complaint of this game, I already played that, simply doesn't apply to the vast majority of the target audience. So the vast majority of reviews of this game are objectively completely worthless. You know, they did nothing to address the actual positive aspects of Donkey Kong Country Returns. In fact, they did everything they could to try and make this out to be some kind of disaster. You know, I saw people like making claims about the frame rate, which were complete and utter lies. I saw people complaining about the visual quality, which is great. You know, I saw everyone like bending over backwards trying to find something to complain about this game, but none of them addressed the fact that Donkey Kong Country Returns is one of the best games on Wii and absolutely deserves to be re-released at full price on Nintendo Switch and find a new audience. And that is the reality when you actually look at this game and its legacy and just the impact it's had on the industry. When you actually take 2 seconds to think about it, as an objective 2D platformer, this is an absolute masterpiece. It has so much going for it. It has so much content. It has so much creativity, so much charm, right? And yet, the gaming media at large does not want to admit it. They don't want to acknowledge that this game has remained relevant for over a decade. They don't want to admit that Donkey Kong has a theme park attraction now. They don't want to admit that like the Mario movie has been successful. All they do is just find something to complain about. Something that just doesn't matter in the slightest. There's a reason that these people don't talk about the actual stage design because it's so impeccable and charming. There's a reason they don't talk about the difficulty because a lot of these people were probably filtered by the later stages. There's a reason they don't talk about this compared to the original games because in a lot of ways, this is better than the original Donkey Kong Country. And in fact, when you really like play the game and really start experiencing it, like in a lot of ways, it's better than Tropical Freeze as well. There's a lot to be said about this game, a lot of positive aspects that can be talked about and discussed, and yet among the YouTube gaming community, we've heard none of that. Because all they want to do is whine and complain and cry about things that don't matter. And Donkey Kong Country Returns is far from the only victim of that, but it's definitely an example. It's been weird over the past decade to try and watch gaming journalists gaslight people into thinking Donkey Kong is some declining brand when they came out in droves to downplay Tropical Freeze when it came out, to downplay this. It's a really interesting thing to see. And going forward, I do think this is something the community really needs to talk about. They really need to discuss this because, like, this idea that games like this should be condemned because they're re-releases, it's just not realistic to expect Nintendo to not re-release old content in some kind of form. You know, like this idea that this release is disappointing because it's not a new Donkey Kong game, it falls flat on its face because games like this show audiences just how viable the Donkey Kong brand actually is. It's something that newer players can get into and see that like has a lot of potential and growth. And the fact that people are still playing and enjoying this game is just a testament of its quality. But nobody wants to talk about that. You know, nobody wants to acknowledge just how amazing this game actually is. Because that would be admitting that Nintendo successfully managed to reboot Donkey Kong Country after losing Rareware. And that is definitely something the gaming community doesn't want to admit. It really is a Super Mario Bros. 3 situation at this point. You know, people don't like acknowledging the fact that Donkey Kong Country Returns has more mechanics, it has more layered level design, it has more level themes, it has more variety, it's a longer game, right? Like, people don't like addressing the fact that, like, the retro games are better than the Rareware ones, and not by an insignificant margin. To me, this is the big disappointing thing about the Nintendo community as a whole, is that to this day, you have this mindset among people that, like, we can't allow the classic Nintendo games to be overtaken or, like, seen as lesser than their follow-ups. You see this primarily in the Zelda community, but it's very interesting kind of seeing it, like, rear its head in other communities too, whether it's like the Mario 3 thing or the older Fire Emblems or, you know, Xenoblade Chronicles 1 versus the sequels, right? Like, there's this mindset that, like, the gaming media allows some Nintendo games to be popular just so they can turn around and start complaining about other games in the series for not being like this, right? When Donkey Kong Country Returns came out on the Wii, right, after a decade of, like, gaming journals complaining about, you know, Jungle Bee and Jungle Climber, King of Swing, like all, you know, Barrel Blast, you know, all these games for not being Donkey Kong Country, when it finally came back, they ignored it, in spite of being a massive success story and proof of just how skilled Nintendo's developers actually were. Like, this alongside New Super Mario Bros. Wii was proof of just how viable 2D platformers were for Nintendo, and still are to this day. And yet, we're still going through this song and dance where the vast majority of the gaming public refuses to acknowledge it. You know, in 2023, we had people rallying against Super Mario Bros. Wonder, trying to say it wasn't a very good game and was a failure for reasons that they still have not been able to explain. And now, we're seeing the same thing with Donkey Kong Country Returns. Like, it's remarkable to me to see how many gaming YouTubers and gaming journalists tried desperately to downplay this title specifically, tried to downplay Luigi's Mansion 2, which is, I think, cut from the same cloth, because clearly sequels are on the way. Clearly we're going to get new titles in these beloved series, and yet, people don't want to celebrate this genuinely good, exciting 2D platformer. They would rather complain about absolutely nothing. It's very, very sad to see, but it really does need to be addressed. We really do have to talk about this. In spite of its age, Donkey Kong Country Returns is better than Astrobot. This is a more difficult platformer. It has a lot of variety in its locations, in its designs, in the things you do in the game, in its mechanics, and it's not something that ends after 6 hours, right? This is a game that you can easily spend 40 hours in if you try to do everything. Collect every jigsaw piece, find every secret, beat all the stages, beat the game on hard mode, time trials. There's so much to do in this game that keeps you coming back again and again. And the more you play it, the more you start to understand just how much effort went into the design of each and every level. How dynamic and interesting the backgrounds are, how interesting the Tiki Tak tribe are, as new antagonists for the Donkey Kong clan to go up against. You get to see a variety of new cool locations, including a clifftop region featuring living dinosaur fossils. How cool is that, right? The game clearly is aping off of Donkey Kong Country 1's design, its location, but it does so in a way that makes it feel fresh, new, and exciting, even after all this time. If you've played Donkey Kong Country 1 to death, like I have, you understand just what a big deal this is, that Nintendo, with this entry, was able to make something that surpassed the original games. This is just one example, just one of how badly Nintendo has dominated the platforming genre. This is just one example. Whenever you see people praise Astrobot, they always do specific things, talk about the mouse level. Nintendo had a character in a Donkey Kong game that could shrink down and enter mouse holes in 1998. Tiny Kong did that in Donkey Kong 64, and it was way more interesting and fun than anything in Astrobot, right? Nothing that Astrobot does matches up to even mediocre Nintendo platformers, and yet for some reason, we're supposed to put Astrobot on a pedestal while downplaying its very clear superiors with Donkey Kong Country Returns. Now, hopefully, now that the Switch 2 has been unveiled and people are not actively downplaying this re-release, we can finally start talking about how good Donkey Kong Country Returns actually is. But it needs to be acknowledged more than anything that this is a true 10 out of 10 platformer. This is something that really stands the test of time as being one of the best platforming games ever made. That's leaps and bounds above most of its competition. That's just as good as its successor, Tropical Freeze. And it's so frustrating to see this game, much like a ton of its other Wii siblings, get continually downplayed among the gaming media. I genuinely don't feel as if the gaming press as a whole even really gave this game a shot. I doubt they played through it all the way. I imagined they just barely touched it and never spent any real time with it. To me, this game is an absolute gem and should be celebrated as one of the absolute best games from that period.